to communication across the curriculum, or CAC, this week. Our colleague from art history, Ashley Sheffield. And Ashley is going to speak about the DeMille family. Hi, come on in. Her title is Born from Oil, Living as Art Collectors, How the DeMille Family Contributed to Houston's Artistic Identity. Thank you very much for doing this today, Ashley.
Sure, thanks for asking me.
Sure.
So I learned more about the Menil family when I was a graduate student at the University of St. Thomas, which is really just right in front of it. And I was researching some pieces that they have in storage there. So I was over there a lot down in the basement looking at ironworks from the Art Nouveau period. So I wanted to talk about them. They have a really interesting story as far as their role in the culture and with art in Houston. So one thing I talk about in my classes is not just the importance of the artwork themselves, but the patrons, the people who support it, the people who have the money to pay for it, essentially. And the Menils did that for Houston. They also exposed it to the public. They made it available to the public to see. So they had a huge impact on our cultural and artistic identity for the city of Houston. They were really a force to be reckoned with. They both had really strong personalities. They ran into some speed bumps when they were trying to work with some of the original founding families of Houston, who were the rest of the oil tycoons, which we'll talk about in a second. So just some context, I'm going to talk about their early life, some of their background. I'll be talking about Dominique and John, her husband, how they started collecting art, as well as how they factored in being art patrons, art education as far as their relationship to some of the universities in Houston, the Rothko Chapel, and the permanent collection, the Menil Collection, which I mentioned before a couple of y'all came in. I highly recommend that you visit it, but you'll have to wait till the fall. It's being renovated right now. But I do recommend you go to the collection. And then I do have briefly again some of their legacies that I won't talk about, we just don't have time, because they were involved in so much more in the city as well as in the U.S. So first off, Dominique. She was born in Paris. She married John when she was in her early 20s, and she was actually educated at the Sorbonne. She had a degree in mathematics and physics. So it's kind of funny and interesting that her and her husband would become this artistic force when she was not educated in art. Before that, she was the daughter of Conrad Schlumberger, and with Conrad, with his brother, started the Schlumberger oil industry. They actually invented the device that identified minerals and then later liquids like oil based on how it reacted to an electric current. So when anybody needed to drill oil, they called Schlumberger. Sometimes the word schlumberger is still used in the oil field as like drilling and trying to find oil, is pulling a schlumberger. So that's kind of where Dominique was coming from. She was an heiress, financially, very heavily entrenched in this oil family, not really in art. She married John. It was Jean. He would later change his name to John. They married in 1931. They actually met at a ball in Versailles. We're talking about a glamorous way to meet. They were married a year later. In the first few years of their marriage, John didn't want to work for Schlumberger. He wanted to make a name for himself. He didn't want to depend on her family for that. But Dominique's father passed away in 1936. So that's when John came in and helped run the company. So that's how he became involved. In 1941, Dominique and 3 of her children fled Paris when the Germans were invading France a little bit earlier. They made it to New York in 1941. While they were leaving for New York by way of Cuba and then up to New York, John was actually part of a resistance team that was going around Europe, specifically in Romania, and they were destroying some of the Schlumberger equipment and drills and railroads to stop the Nazi Party from getting their information. So once Dominique and the children were in New York, John was able to meet them, and then within that same year, they moved to Houston. Schlumberger had set up an office in Houston several years before that, so obviously oil brought them to Houston after they fled France. I'll have several quotes throughout the presentation from Dominique and John, but this is one of my favorites. She says, I would never have started collecting so much art if I had not moved to Houston. When they arrived in Houston, it was still a relatively new city, being only 100 years old. To a European, that's brand new. And so Dominique, in several interviews, she describes Houston as being provincial, a dormant place. There weren't many galleries or art dealers like she was used to in Paris, as well as New York in her short time there. There was the Museum of Fine Arts, but she and John both found it very underwhelming. They were impressed by it. Just to give you an idea of some other cultural aspects of Houston at the time, there was a symphony. There wasn't an opera yet, nor a theater company. But the symphony, they had to practice in this kind of auditorium, dilapidated building next to a livestock show and yard. So when they brought in the cattle, the symphony would have to move. And so that's the Houston that the Menils were coming into. Also, what some articles call as the guardian families of Houston, the old money was still heavily agricultural, also in lumber. Oil companies were already there as well, other families who ran oil companies. So you have men like William Marsh Rice, who started Rice University or Rice Institution. Some names you might recognize, Kirby, just from street names, anyway around Houston, as well as the Blaffers and the Fondrens. You might recognize the Blaffers. If you go to the Museum of Fine Arts, there's the whole collection of the Blaffer collection. Also, they're tied to the University of Houston and their museum there. And even the Museum of Fine Arts Houston was founded by an oil man. So there was a lot of pushback from these families already in Houston when the Menils came in wanting to have some kind of artistic control. They didn't like the newcomers taking over their territory because these people were the sole patrons of the arts in Houston. It wouldn't be until later, more in the 50s and the 60s, where the Menils would have some role in the Museum of Fine Arts. But even then, there was still a lot of tension, especially with the Blaffers. They would try to give some of their artwork to show or want to hang it. They were always denied. And then later, when some of the Blaffers tried to give art to them, they denied them. So there was this continuous tension between the other families in Houston. So that's some background information on the Menils when they arrived and kind of what they were coming into. When they got to Houston, they saw it more as a challenge to raise the standards of the city artistically and to bring especially modern art to Houston. So they started collecting art essentially when they were still in Paris, when they were still newlyweds. This is a quote by John. He says, "If you think I'm rich from Schlumberger, you're only half right. I'm a much wealthier man because of our art." And they shared that. They were able to share it. But the piece that really started in collecting is this portrait done by the artist Max Ernst. and it's a portrait of Dominique. Ernst was a surrealist artist, and so the Menils, John and Dominique, are living in Paris. They're newlyweds, and they're trying to decorate their apartment. And there's this blank wall in the dining room, and a friend suggests they hire Ernst to do a mural. They tell Dominique he does great birds. Dominique looks into it. She doesn't like it. She doesn't like his style. And so Ernst is expecting them to commission something. They don't want to disappoint the friend or Ernst, so they say, okay, how about you do a portrait of Dominique? So she goes and sits a few times for him to do a portrait. When it's done, she doesn't like it. She felt he made her look stiff. She didn't appreciate or understand the composition of it. So she said, okay, it goes to the framers. She leaves information for it to be shipped back to her when it's done framing. But there was a mix-up and it was never sent, and she was okay with that. She didn't miss it. The portrait was hanging up in the framer's shop when someone they knew recognized her and had it sent over to her years later. So it comes in, she still doesn't like it. She leaves it in a brown wrapping from the framers and sticks it on top of an armoire in their apartment and leaves it. Now, when she and the children fled France, this was left in the apartment. It wasn't until the 40s, after the war, that she went back to their apartment to check on things, get some things, and she'd forgotten about this and it was still there. Their apartment had even been ransacked during the war, where soldiers were looking for important Schlumberger papers and plans for the drilling, but the painting was left untouched. So when she opened it, by this time, she had had a new appreciation for art because she had been taught by some friends and some mentors about modern art. So now she appreciated this portrait by Max Ernst. So both John and Dominique were kind of led and taught by some of their friends and mentors. One of them was a Dominican priest. His name was Marie-Alain Couturier, to check my French, I'm better at Italian. But he was in France, and he was a priest. He believed that modern art did have a place in a spiritual setting, as far as in the churches. It didn't just have to be classical or Renaissance, or Gothic, which a lot of times was the tradition. And so he really brought that to light for the Menils, and that would influence them in the building of the Rothko chapel, as far as the art having a spiritual nature to it. Another figure and friend was an art dealer from New York, and they, between the Dominican priest and their art dealer friend in New York, they taught them about modern art. They even convinced them to buy some. So that's really what started the process as far as collecting the art for the Menils. And from there, it really exploded. Sometimes you might read articles or find, or I have found in history, people who have the money to buy art oftentimes might buy it and then just donate it as a tax write-off. That wasn't the goal with the Menils. They bought art to share it with the public. They learned about the styles of the artists. They supported the artists. They hired them for more work. When they were working with the different universities, they hired students to work with them, with their collections, in their homes. And so the Menils really took a different aspect to that versus just having it either for prestige, because owning art has always come with prestige, and then also appreciating it for what it is, not just as either the prestige or a tax write-off if they donate it. So as they're collecting, they did try to donate some of their works or loan some of their works to the Museum of Fine Arts. John even asked for space in the basement to hang some modern pieces, and they were turned down time and time again. Some institutions that they were a part of, they actually did help start what would become the Contemporary Arts Museum of Houston. And then with each project or institution that the Menils were a part of, they really wanted either full control, or they wanted a lot of control with their artwork, and the institutions wouldn't give it to them. So with some of these, even the ones that they helped start, like the Contemporary Arts Museum, there was a lot of pushback because they wanted complete control. So sometimes it was, okay, I'm going to take my ball and go home. And so they would leave these various places because they couldn't have the control that they wanted. They tended to work on this huge international scale and put on shows about surrealism combined with medieval works, and they wanted it to be up to par with Paris and New York. So they did this, but really dragging Houston behind it, kicking and screaming, fighting the modernism. But that was really some of their goals, bringing the modern art to Houston, exposing people to it so they could appreciate it. With the Museum of Fine Arts and that relationship, later John would serve on the board, and some gifts were given later when they kind of got over the initial shock of having this new people come in. And they did play some roles in modern shows, especially as the museum grew. And Cullen and Hall, which is the building, when you walk up to it, there's a second level, and that's where some of their shows, like their traveling shows are. When that hall opened, the Menils were a part of the modern shows there, but after a while, when some other gifts were rejected or they were slighted in some way, John would serve on the board. They might give money, but they stopped giving art to the Museum of Fine Arts, even before they started the Menil Collection. So after the initial collecting in the 50s and 60s, those 2 decades were really prime years for how much they collected. Some people even said it seemed like every day a new piece of work arrived at their home. They did have a home built where they housed a lot of this. They would house this at the University of St. Thomas. And I'll talk about their relationship with St. Thomas in a second. But it was to the point where Dominique was almost obsessed with it. She said, what I admire, I must possess. And it seemed like that was how much they were bringing in and all the different types of artwork they were bringing in. It wasn't just modern. So, sorry, my date's a little off there in the box, but they were buying contemporary works. All of these images are in the Menil Collection except for one. They bought works by Magritte, the surrealist artist, as well as Mark Rothko, and they'll have more of a relationship with Rothko later. They have works by Mondrian, so they're buying either modern and some contemporary artists for their collection. The Pollock is they actually provided the funds to the MFAH to buy it, so this was a gift to them. This is still at the MFAH. So they were buying modern and contemporary works, but they were also interested in medieval and Byzantine works. They also enjoyed collecting ancient works. This is from the Cycladic Islands near Greece, and they also collected Egyptian works, Hellenistic works, Roman works, as well as African works like this one. And sometimes they would combine the shows to where you had surrealist works mixed with either African or medieval works, together working as one. Their interests were kind of all over the place. Basically, their collecting idea was if they liked it and they could afford it, they bought it. So even what they have doesn't fit into the museum in the exhibition space. There's a lot of works in the basement, upstairs in the offices in the Menil Collection. Anything that was like fun to look at, even knickknacks, Dominique wanted it and they bought it. They even tried to get some of their friends in on the deal as far as collecting. So they started a print club where there was a buy-in for anywhere from $5 to $200, and they bought works by Roy Lichtenstein, These aren't necessarily examples of what was part of the print club, just these are works by these artists in the Menil Collection. Other works by Lichtenstein look like comic books. If you're familiar with him. They bought more of Max Ernst, more of his works after that portrait. And this is a later print after the print club, but is an example of one of Warhol's prints, in this case a portrait of Dominique. So a lot of times she was the subject for the artist that they commissioned. So the print club was successful. They also started a group called Art Investments, where they invited some of their friends to invest in 9 works. It was $10,000 a share. So a lot to me, I don't know if it's a lot to you, but their wealthier friends in Houston who had the money to do it, they wanted to put their money to use as far as having these artworks go throughout Houston, and they could put it in their homes and share it with their friends. So they purchased 9 works, and these works were on a 3-month rotation between their friends in Houston. So not only did they collect themselves, they wanted the other wealthy families in Houston to also collect, to have this exposure to different types of artworks. Even their children would collect art when they were grown, or maybe several of them started certain artistic foundations. So they started collecting themselves. So that legacy of collecting and supporting the arts filtered to all 5 of their children. So the Menils did have an interesting relationship with a couple of the universities in Houston. The first one being the University of St. Thomas. I put this title up here, The Medici of Modern Art, because oftentimes in several articles this nickname is used for the Menils. For those of you who might not be familiar, the Medici is in reference to the powerful Florentine family during the Renaissance, as far as being art patrons, starting art academies. But they were also the power behind Florence. Even though Florence was a republic at the time, they held the purse strings. And so a lot of people equate the Menils and kind of how they moved in and took over everything, like the Medici in Florence. So I just think it's an interesting nickname. There was an article apparently that came out this weekend, someone else was telling me about it earlier today, where this was in part of the title, is referencing the Menils. Like the Medici. But as far as them coming in full force and taking over, essentially, with good intentions and good results, they did this with the University of St. Thomas. Initially, St. Thomas was a newer university when the Menils were living here, and before they approached St. Thomas with their plan and their money and land for the university, their reputation preceded them as far as wanting to take control. But because the university really needed some benefactors, they needed more students, they needed more room, the Basilian Fathers, this group of priests who started the university, welcomed the Menils to come to St. Thomas. So they donated some land for St. Thomas to build on and expand, but there were certain stipulations. They would choose the architects, they would choose the art that went to certain buildings, they would choose art shows for the university. And this is where I mentioned before where they would combine surrealism and medieval art. They had the space to do it at the University of St. Thomas. Anecdote about some of the surrealist shows. After one in particular, a prominent figure in Houston approached the school board and said, "You have to take that show down. There's hidden communist symbols in them. There's hammers and sickles all throughout these surrealist paintings." Luckily, they ignored him and just let him go. But over time, there would be tension between the Menils and those who started the university. The Menils brought in their own people to work as staff and faculty at the university. They hired a woman who was a curator for them at the Contemporary Arts Museum to really head up the art department. But she did die young from diabetes complications, and that's when Dominique just took over the art department herself. There was a rumor that the art department budget was more than the university. I mean, can you imagine, Robbie, if the art department budget was more than the university? I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what, the whispers that were going around campus. That's how much clout the Menils had with the university. What became an issue was not, as some people said, religious. The De Menils were Catholic. John grew up Catholic, Dominique converted, and that initially was what drew them to the university, to help out the only Catholic university in Houston. So some say it was traditional Catholicism versus some of John's views. He was a ecumenicist, but he believed that all faiths should be studied to truly raise the level and raise the bar at the university. But really it had to do with conservatism versus liberalism. This was Houston in the 60s. And so you had this European family coming from Paris down through New York, really hammering their ideas and their people into this university. This is a quote by one of the presidents from 79 to 85. He said they wanted a bunch of Northeasterners to come down and run the place. They didn't know St. Thomas from a hole in the ground. So it's interesting because I know people from here who still talk about the East Coast like that, as far as that was the view of these outsiders coming in to take over. Initially it was a good relationship, and then it turned bad based on how much control the Menils wanted. The priests and the board who started the university felt that they had lost some of the foundations that they started the school with, that it was essentially becoming Menil University, because they were so pronounced in the school. So, the Menils did have so much control with the university, except on the board. They couldn't be on the board. It was only clergy. Lay people couldn't be in control. So John had a problem with this. After a lot of the negotiations, the Menils bought back some of the land that they had donated. They bought back the art that was at the university, and they left, and they went to Rice. And so as I'm learning this while I'm working on my thesis in the art department, as an art department student, like a punch in the gut. I was like, oh, what? No, why? Because the art department was such a big deal. They hired students to work with them. They would bring in artists like Warhol and Rothko. They would come to the university. Great artistic figures. But they left St. Thomas and joined Rice. They not only brought their money and their art, but faculty went with them. Students followed them from St. Thomas to Rice. A lot of people equate that, they call it like the divorce at St. Thomas. So, but John and Dominique were able to do at Rice what they couldn't do at St. Thomas. And at the time of the move, Rice was actually trying to establish a strong art department. So the timing couldn't have been better for Rice at this point. So all of these different institutions that they were a part of, a lot of it, the leaving and coming back and the problems had to do with control. They were able to get more with the Rothko Chapel. So the Menils strongly believed in the spiritual nature of art, mainly from their friend in France, one of the initial ones who taught them about modern art and that idea of experiencing art on a spiritual level. And so they did this with the Rothko Chapel. They had commissioned several paintings by Mark Rothko. There would be 14 in total. They commissioned him in 1964, which he completed in 66, but they still didn't have a permanent place to put these truly massive canvases. And so they kind of moved around. At the time, they were still at St. Thomas, so some were housed at St. Thomas, some were moved to the Contemporary Arts Museum, like via a friend, that they were just stored. So they started building the chapel with Rothko's help. There was a lot of back and forth between, especially Dominique, Rothko, the architects that she had hired to build the main building. Rothko did have a say as far as the shape of the building. He wanted to create a total art environment versus just having paintings up on the wall. And so, but there's a lot of back and forth. Rothko didn't want artificial lights, he wanted only natural light. The lighting to this day is still kind of an issue. The ceiling height changed. Dominique wanted to paint the walls, just constant back and forth, to the point that Rothko didn't actually see the chapel finished. He committed suicide in February of 1970. So he didn't get to see where his paintings would eventually, the completed building. So this is the inside. Have any of y'all been to the Rothko Chapel? Okay. If you haven't, I do recommend you go. A lot of times it's not necessarily what people expect. They're used to seeing really colorful Rothkos, and they see these large, dark canvases. And with the lighting being an issue, they do look black, like from the pictures, but it is a muddled purples and browns and grays throughout the work. But a lot of people, or that I've talked to, are actually kind of disappointed at first when they walk in, and when they sit in the space, they enjoy it, because it is a special space. The chapel was finally dedicated in '72. Out in front, there is a sculpture called the Broken Obelisk. And this was meant to be a gift to the city. It was supposed to sit outside City Hall. And there was an inscription on it that was dedicated to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So his death was still pretty recent at this point. When they wanted to present it to the city, Mayor Welch refused. And the main reason for this refusal was having to do with Martin Luther King. So there's a city official that contacted John and said, how about another inscription? John says, okay, how about something from the Bible? It says, forgive them for they know not what they do, which I thought was particularly funny, but also a little dark in that you still have this tension between the city of Houston, the people who are running the city, and the Menils for trying to give them something. So the obelisk found a permanent home in front of the chapel. Is still there. There was actually, interestingly enough, there is a new art opera out. It was performed last year, I believe, about the Rothko Chapel. I got to see it, and it goes through and switches from scene to scene. The character of Dominique singing about how the Rothko Chapel is being built, her relationship with Mark, all the changes that are being made, and then the scene will switch to someone experiencing the chapel for the first time. So it starts with one man who's a construction worker. They're actually working on another building near the chapel, and he's just going in because it has air conditioning. So he sits for a while on his break, and he talks about how the paintings make him feel. And you go back to a scene with Dominique. The next figure is a Latina woman who's a lesbian, and she's there for a friend's funeral. And so in the 80s, it talks about a stay-at-home mom who's just trying to get away from her kids, and she goes into the Rothko Chapel. So you have these different characters throughout the opera experiencing the interior of the Rothko Chapel. So it's very interesting. Unfortunately, John died at the age of 69 from cancer not too long after the chapel was dedicated. So the chapel is meant as a center for all faiths. That goes along with their belief as far as all faiths should be celebrated. They have meditation sessions there. They still have lectures there at the Rothko Chapel. So it's also a place of learning as far as those lectures goes. I really enjoy this space. I've come across some people or some fellow students while I was in grad school who felt a weird feeling in there, and I don't know what that was. But so there's a lot of different reactions to the chapel, but it was meant for the idea of peace and understanding inside this building. So after the Rothko Chapel, after John's death, is when plans for the Menil Collection, the permanent collection to be housed, starts. This will really be the institution where there's absolute control for Dominique. And I know I've emphasized that a lot, and it sounds bad on their part, but they were just trying so hard to give a gift of art, and there were so many times where they were stopped, and so they were constantly fighting to be able to show their artwork the way they felt it was meant to be shown or shared. So they were able to do this with the Menil Collection. This quote, "Look sharp, something important is going here," well, apparently was actually a sign on the construction side of the Menil Collection behind St. Thomas, which I thought was pretty funny as far as it was true. There was something important for the neighborhood going up. With the Menil Collection, Dominique essentially created a neighborhood of art. That was her goal. You still had some of the architecture of St. Thomas that they had been part of. You had the Rothko Chapel and then the Menil Collection kind of in several blocks that you could go and see all three at the same time. There's grassy areas around the Menil Collection. We call the Menil Park. So it does have a very neighborhood feel around it because there's still houses that sit and face the Menil Collection. It's not this huge, massive museum that you climb the stairs to walk up to. It's part of the neighborhood. Dominique and John did have plans to start a permanent collection or a place to house their collection since the early 70s. There was a large budget. They even got more money when they kind of hinted at donors that they may or may not keep the collection in Houston. So people gave more money for it to stay in Houston. There were rumors going about as whether Dominique would have it in New York or Paris, and she says, what do New York and Paris need with another museum? And so she chose to stay in Houston. She chose to be here. She wanted the museum to seem small on the outside and bigger on the inside, but it was designed so that you could walk around and not get tired. A lot of people get museum fatigue. I do, and I love museums, and you still get tired inside a museum. And she didn't want that, so it's very easy to move about. It is small. There's a rotating collections, but you feel refreshed afterwards. You don't bog yourself down looking at piece after piece after piece. And so she designed it with that in mind. She also wanted all of the art to be exhibited at ground level, and it is still today. It's the idea of it being accessible to all people. You don't have to walk up steps to get to this greater level or this thing that seems highbrow like some museums are. It was at ground level. You could walk in as if you were walking into somebody's house. Also, she wanted it to always be free. And that has to do with sharing with the public, make sure anybody can go and get into this building and look at their artwork. A lot of their collection isn't on display. They collected so much, there's just not room. So they rotated out. There's a ton of artwork in the basement. There's storage rooms in the second level where there are offices. Dominique called those the treasure rooms. and the people who work there, as of a few years ago, still call them that. And they do feel like that as far as just this plethora of art that you get to see that's not on display, you know, or that's how I felt when I got to go up there. So Dominique does have the space where essentially everything is her say. She said there wasn't another museum or gallery that could show her art like she wanted it to be shown. So the Menil Collection opened in June of 1987. At the opening, Dominique credited her husband with opening her eyes and helping her realize her love of art. A lot of times when looking into the Menil story, there's a lot of emphasis on Dominique. But John really was a part of everything too. But Dominique apparently was the one who was easier to get along with. And she did outlive him for a long time, so she was active even after his death. There's one story from an article where someone was describing John as the one where they'd be in a meeting and he'd yell at everybody and say, "You're not good enough," and storm out. And Dominique would stay and reassure everybody and say, "No, you're good enough, we'll hire you for the job," kind of thing. So that's a way you hear a lot about Dominique and her legacy.
But she was the one with the money.
Yes, she
That's
was
not-
also the
Yeah.
So
People usually think the
Schlumberger-
wife comes along with the
Yeah.
husband, but she.
And so a lot of it is Dominique as far as her world because of the money. She was the reassuring one. But John was also interested in art. He helped with the collecting. He wanted to be a part of it as well. Their collection is considered one of the best private ones, along with collections in Boston, York, and Washington, D.C., which is saying a lot as far as I went to one recently in Boston at the Gardner Museum. It was one of those private collections. And to say that Houston has one compared to the more prominent cities usually, as far as culturally usually, is saying a lot. We have one of the best private collections and it's free. Here are just some photos of Dominique at the collection while it's being built, designing the display spaces as far as where things would be. They still use this method. It was still kind of in the common room to set up displays and exhibitions using the model of the exhibition space. She said, "I always felt a sort of energy in Houston. I always felt that what didn't exist would happen within a couple of years. I always felt things were possible." There were several of her friends who mentioned in interviews that she wouldn't have been able to do what she did in Houston as far as the Menil Collection if she were in Paris or in New York. It just wouldn't have worked out like it did here. There was the space and the opportunity to do so. She passed away at the age of 89 in 1997. But not only her legacy as this patron and this heiress to oil, but she was also became people's confidants. Those who worked for her at the Menil Collection really became her friends. While I was researching the pieces I was looking at, there were some documents in the file, like letters, and it was someone she had sent to France to look for some Art Nouveau pieces, and it was a daughter of a friend who happened to be working for Dominique. And in this letter from the girl working over there describing what she had found, how much her daily cost was, things like that, at the end in the postscript she's telling Dominique about a date she went on. So the Menils were also people's confidants. They made friends with the people who were working with them. And so I just thought that was interesting. I've seen those little tidbits, but it wasn't, just work. That they really created, they surrounded themselves with friends, treating them like family in that aspect. Here are some photos inside the Menil Collection. As far as the different types of artwork, you can see on the upper left-hand side on the right-hand wall, that's a Warhol print. But then there's also galleries with huge windows that showcase African art. There's another section with the medieval art. And usually, sometimes these will change out. They'll also have visiting shows. But most of it is their collection, their work. There's a lot of natural light, which is what Dominique wanted for this space. You move easily throughout the galleries. So it's just a very easy place to be, to where you don't get tired. People who aren't familiar with art or saying, I don't want to go to the museum, I don't like art, I don't like looking at art. The Menil Collection is kind of the solution to that. So that's what I tell people when they ask where to go, but I don't want to go anywhere boring, which to me is never boring, but I understand if you're not in the art world that it can be. And so that's where the Menil Collection comes in, as far as being able to see it and enjoy it kind of at your own pace without being overwhelmed. Some of her legacy, specifically Dominique, as far as I mentioned, her children all became involved in the arts, whether it's collectors. One of her sons would produce movies. One of her daughters started an art foundations in New York. Other galleries and institutions that are part of the Menil family, the Menil Drawing Institute opened in 2008. The Dan Flavin installation, that's close to the Menil Collection with his light installations. There's also the Cy Twombly Gallery. These are all within blocks of each other in Montrose. And then also the Byzantine Fresco Chapel is kind of across the street from the Menil Collection. It had been closed for a time and it reopened in 2015. And there is a show going on right now. So you can't necessarily go to the Menil Collection right now, but you could go to the Byzantine Chapel. The Menils were heavily involved in the civil rights movement in the U.S. as well as Houston. So there are some things that I didn't mention. Dominique established a foundation with former President Jimmy Carter. So we see them pictured there on the right. And then on the left is Dominique with Nelson Mandela at an event at the Rothko Chapel. So all of these dignitaries and big names in history would come to Houston and visit the Menils. Their house was almost like a salon of sorts, as they had artists and writers and dignitaries and filmmakers all together with the Menils experiencing their artwork and talking about other social aspects like the civil rights movement. She was also awarded the National Merit of Arts in 1986. So the next photo is just kind of a fun one. This is Renee Magritte and Dominique at a rodeo in Simonton, just outside of Houston, southwest of us, in 1965. Magritte, if you remember, he painted the work "This Is Not a Pipe." So he was visiting. She's wearing fur to the rodeo. Magritte brought his dog. You can kind of see him by his right arm. Along with Magritte and his wife, the dog's nanny was also there at this rodeo. Apparently, Magritte was a fan of Bonanza, so they went to the rodeo together while he was in town meeting with the Menils. Here's another photo of someone you recognize. Andy Warhol on the right with one of the models that he worked with, Jane Ford, and then Dominique. They're at an opening at Rice in October of '69. So in the amount of time when they transitioned from St. Thomas to Rice, a lot of things happened fast as far as gallery openings and exhibitions happening at the university. Here's some books that are interesting about the Menils. I've read through Art and Activism, edited by Joseph Helfenstein and Lorraine Shipsey. This book on the right, Double Vision, it came out last month, so I haven't read it yet. But it looks really interesting as far as a really in-depth, really more of a biography about Dominique and John. Where's the article from? This article, What I Admire and Must Possess, from Texas Monthly. full of information. It's a really interesting read as far as their overall story.